Welcome on board the Newstrack. On the show this evening, two heavyweight voices with opposing points of view. The Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India, Dr. Subramanian, will be speaking first, and then we'll have former Finance Minister, heavyweight from the UPA government, Mr. P. Chidambaram, presenting an alternate point of view of the current state of the Indian economy, the devastation caused as a result of the second wave of the COVID pandemic, and the speed of economic recovery from your questions that are central to each of our lives. And that's our top focus on the Newstrack.
Biggest contraction in GDP. Unemployment rate soars. Second wave cripples recovery. Slowdown fears loom. Only pandemic to blame? KV Subramanian versus P. Chidambaram. The big Newstrack showdown.
The Government of India has said that the Indian economy last year contracted by 7.3%. The big question in the minds of everyone who's watching is about the impact that the second wave of the pandemic has had on the Indian economy in this year and the growth projections going forward. Because the sooner we're able to get the economy back on track, the sooner people are able to get back to work, the sooner life will start returning to normal. But that also runs the risk of the pandemic rearing its ugly head again. To talk about where the Indian economy is at this moment, the loss to the first quarter of this year, and what may happen in the months to come, I'm joined on this broadcast by the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Subramanian. Welcome, sir. It's very good to have you with us on the Newstrack.
Very good evening to all our viewers and to you, Rahul.
The numbers you put out yesterday said that the GDP growth for 2021 was at a contraction of 7.3%. We've now done with April, we're done with May. From what you're picking up so far, what's your best sense of the impact that the second wave of the COVID pandemic has had on India's growth numbers in the first quarter of this year, sir? Welcome.
Rahul, before we talk about that, it is important to analyze the fourth quarter numbers. After the decline in the first quarter of 24.4%, there has been a progressive improvement with the gross value added in the fourth quarter being 3.6%. And emphasizing the gross value added because of the significant change in the accounting method, and that's, for the third and the fourth quarter, that is the right measure to look at. Especially if you look at also construction sector had grown by about 15%, and that's important because it provides jobs to the informal, in the informal sector, the urban poor. There was also significant increase in the gross fixed capital formation in the economy. So overall, up until March, the recovery had proceeded very well. Of course, the last 2 months, which is your April and May, have been impacted because of the second wave of the pandemic. And if you look at the high frequency indicators, many of the mobility indicators have declined in the month of April and May, but have started picking up again over the last 10 days. If you look at the e-way bills and the power sector, power demand, even on a year-to-year basis, so that any seasonality is accounted for, and we have to do doing an apples-to-apples comparison. Over the last 10 days, things have started picking up, which is reflecting the fact that the second wave is on its decline. And I think a pertinent point here is that if you look at the second wave, the pace of rise was very, very swift. At the same time, the pace of the decline has been equally swift as well. So I expect, therefore, that in this month, and today is the first day, of course, many of the states should go into easing of their restrictions. One important aspect that we must remember when we look at the impact on the economy is that these set of restrictions were more, driven by states, and therefore were asynchronous and were heterogeneous as well, especially in terms of the timing of the restrictions. and that is something that will have basically its impact in ensuring that the impact will not be as large as it was in the
So in the first quarter of last year, the economy contracted by 24%, but that was also a total lockdown. Nobody really knew what COVID was about, and therefore everything just froze. This time, many of the supply chains which had earlier packed up have still been open. The wheels of the economy have been trudging along, even if they're not been galloping along. How would you compare the impact on the economy in the first quarter of this year with that of the first quarter of last year, which is when we had a total lockdown, very different from what we've seen this year?
So, Rahul, as you rightly pointed out, last year around this time, there was a lot of uncertainty because, how would the response, the health response be? Doctors, for instance, started using a lot of ventilation and then discovered that it was not required as much. So, the economy has moved from a situation of unknown unknowns to known unknowns. There is certainly uncertainty now, but it's not as much as around the last time. The other important point, and we've been looking at other countries that have had second waves as well. One of the key things that stands out is the economic impact of the second wave in other countries that have experienced second and third waves has not been as has not manifested as much as the first wave, precisely because countries have learned to deal or work around the pandemic, and therefore the impact.
No, but the
has
one
not
difference and the one variable in comparing India with some of the other countries which also witnessed a second wave is the speed of vaccination. Our population is much bigger, even though in sheer terms of the jabs that are being administered, the numbers rank well, but as a percentage of the population, the numbers are so low that when you compare with a country like the US or even the UK, our overall percentage of the population vaccinated, which is also very crucial in determining how fast the economy can start opening up, is at this moment at a much lower threshold than internationally, and therefore it's not directly comparable what happened in the US, UK with a country like India at this moment.
That may be true, but I do want to point out, if you look at the percentage of the population that has received its first dose, and I do look at that aspect, because if you read a lot of the research that has come in epidemiology, there is a significant impact that is coming on average from the first dose itself. So if you look at, for instance, in the United States, across the various states, the impact of the first dose on actual death rates is significant. And India has vaccinated about 15% of the population has gotten the first dose. The second dose is about 5%, less than 5% or so. I'm talking about on average, and with the emphasis now on expanding supply. And I think this remains the most important. I have been mentioning this earlier as well. If you would have been following the monthly economic reports that the ministry puts out as well, the importance of vaccination has been emphasized repeatedly. So the acceleration in the progress of vaccination is by far most critical, because again, I go back to, if you look at the Q4 numbers, the fact that consumption grew at about 2.7% after having declined for 3 quarters. And if you look at the investment itself, gross fixed capital formation increasing by about 10.8%. That was because the fear of the pandemic had reduced significantly, and that is quite critical going forward as well. And therefore, vaccination and accelerating the progress of vaccination is very important. Here, I think the first dose, as I mentioned, will play its part, but we certainly have to actually go about doing the full vaccination program at a higher pace.
So we've spoken about the macroeconomy numbers. Let's now come down to what's happening to individuals and their finances. The one indicator that we have is that the per capita GDP is now down to numbers last seen in 2016-17, which is 99,700, which is India's total GDP per capita divided by the population. So therefore, if you were to look at per capita GDP numbers, we're now in a spot where countries like Bangladesh are ahead of us. What are you making of this decline? The fact that while it's hit government finances, most certainly, individual finances have been very badly impacted as well. How concerned are you about that?
So Rahul, this has to be seen in the context of the exceptional period that the global economy has been experiencing. Last year, the IMF's economic report had pointed out that if you look at the number of countries where GDP per capita is on a decline, that proportion is at a 150-year high. I think that is something that you have to keep in mind. There has been a decline, as you have seen in yesterday's numbers, 7.3%, which has been better than the revised estimates, that the second advanced estimates of 8%. But still 6.3% decline, which has had an impact on the numerator that you talked about. So your numerator has basically declined and the denominator has grown at 1.5–2%, and therefore this is just the arithmetic. I think the recovery that has happened since the first quarter is something that does give us encouragement that once the effect of the pandemic, the second wave, is lower, then the economy should be back, and some of the pent-up demand also should come back. If you notice, as I was mentioning, consumption did increase in the fourth quarter by about 2.7% because of the spending that happened on construction sector, the overall infrastructure spending, and that is an emphasis that the country has placed through its economic policy, which will help in accelerating.
So you mentioned, Dr. Subramanian, pent-up demand, and if the economy, once the second wave gets over and things start opening up, is to bounce back, pent-up demand will be very important. But the flip side to this is, given the high fatality, given the high medical bills that people have run up, given the distress, given the unemployment, the financial condition of the Indian household may be such that pent-up demand that you're banking on may not immediately materialize, because there is unlike the first wave where you were locked down but you didn't feel the pinch yourself, here many families, many seeing this broadcast at this time, have felt the death, the devastation, the misery and the financial expenses too.
So here's where I would go back to the budget this year, which was commended across the board for the expansionary stance that was taken by the government in trying to increase expenditure, especially expenditure on infrastructure, on construction activity. As we've discussed just now, that has had its impact in the fourth quarter. Eventually, when you look at the evidence, sustained growth comes from investment, especially private investment, that is crowded in by public sector investment in infrastructure. And the government in its budget had actually taken this into account and has taken a significantly expansionary stance. The impact of that will indeed come in. You have to keep in mind that despite the local restrictions in the month of April, the core measure of infrastructure production had recorded a growth of 56% in the month of April. Of course, has been through a lower base as of last year, but still the emphasis on infrastructure is certainly there, and which will create jobs in the informal sector, and that is the way to really put money in the hands of people and enable the economic recovery.
What are you making of the joblessness numbers that have come out? The Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy estimates that since the beginning of the pandemic last year, 97% of Indian households have seen a decline in their incomes, and 10 million Indians have lost their job because of the second wave of the COVID pandemic. Do you agree with these assessments? How concerned are you? What's the government's plan to fix the employment situation?
Rahul, I must point out that a senior official in the ministry that works in my team had written a very, very nice piece in the Economic Times, pointing out some of the inadequacies in the survey methodologies of CMI, on the employment front. For instance, if a smell test that is quite critical, employment changes should correlate with economic growth, which it does not in the case of the CMI. In contrast, the periodic labor force survey, PLFS, indeed does. So, I would actually wait for the PLFS numbers. I think there is no denying that there will be some impact of the second wave, on this. But I think the numbers have to be from a reliable source for us to actually take this into account. As I said, yesterday as well in my press briefing, the overall impact of the second wave is not likely to be very large. It is certainly going to be there, but not very large, given the fact that it is, a shorter time period, very high, a peak, and then actually a very fast pace of decline as well. So once the restrictions are removed and economic activity comes back, which is indeed what happened, and if you recall, after the first quarter numbers had come, I had indeed mentioned that there will be a recovery, and I'm glad to mention that indeed did transpire, based on the economic assessments. So I see no reason why, once the restrictions are removed now as well, that economic activity should come back, and that should enable the recovery, that had been happening up till March. Some of the momentum has been affected because of the second wave, but once the second wave, actually the decline happens fully, I think the economic activity should come back, and the recovery should proceed along.
Are you concerned about the urban joblessness rate? Because while rural joblessness is actually not as much of a concern, in urban areas, from what CMIE is saying, and you're contesting those numbers, there's the urban joblessness rate was about 18% in the week that ended the 30th of May, which is 3% more than a fortnight ago. So they're essentially saying that during the second wave in urban areas, and typically a formal job is something that takes much longer to come back than an informal job, and therefore some of this urban joblessness will stay for much longer than rural joblessness. Even if you contest the actual figures or the percentages, intuitively this does make sense that it takes tougher to create a job in a formal economy, and it takes lesser time for a job to come back in the informal economy.
Rahul, let me first clarify that, as I make careful work, I am contesting the methodology numbers. Eventually, it's the process leads to the product, and as I have already described, that there is, a significant amount of fixing in the process that needs to, and therefore I would not rely on those numbers as much. That said, I think, as did happen in the first wave as well, I have reason to believe that there will be an impact, and I think if we've acknowledged that. The one important factor that I will mention is, if you looked at the fourth quarter, construction sector actually grew by 15%. And that was because of the emphasis on infrastructure spending, especially by the government. So, once the pandemic, the second wave of the pandemic has played its course, and construction activity picks up because of the front loading of infrastructure spending, you will see urban poor, especially informal sector, getting a lot of push through the construction activity. And once the recovery comes back, I think the impact should also be there on the formal sector jobs as well, because do notice that investment spending, the fixed capital formation in the economy, did pick up significantly, in the fourth quarter, and a good part of that, of course, was through the government, but about half of the growth in the fixed capital formation in the economy was through the private sector. And eventually it is the investment-driven growth that is a sustained one, and it should manifest, as it did before the second wave actually robbed some of the momentum.
What are your models telling you? What are the numbers that you're projecting for the entire year? We saw the IMF, that's before the second wave really took off, predicted that the Indian economy would grow at 11.5%. Now we're seeing numbers from SBI at 7.9%, from CARE 8.8 to 9%, RBI 10.5%. The economic survey that you put together said 11.5%. Where are you at this moment?
Just a quick correction, we said 11% in the economic survey. As I mentioned yesterday in the press conference, we have evaluated, early April, we had looked at two different scenarios, one of which where the pandemic peaks around mid-May, and the other a more worst case scenario where the pandemic actually peaks in mid-June. So now the actual path of the pandemic seems to resemble more the former scenario, which is the peak around mid-May. And based on that, we've estimated, I would not give you a specific range because of the significant uncertainty there is. There will be some impact, but I would definitely mention that the impact is unlikely to be very large.
Okay. There's been a big demand for cash transfers. There's been a demand from industry that the government must print more money, that there must be a stimulus. If not now, when? These questions have been asked in the past, they're being asked again.
So, I would mention here that the budget, which is a budget for not just for a couple of months, but for the full year, was a significantly expansionary one. As the revised numbers have come in, the fiscal deficit is 9.3% for the last year and has been projected at at much higher than what was earlier thought of for this year as well. So the budget is an expansionary one with an emphasis on capital spending, on infrastructure spending, which should definitely boost the construction sector as well. The other important observation that I would make is if you look at the contact sensitive sectors as well, the travel, tourism, etc. Q4, after having declined significantly, for instance, by about 8% in Q3 and even more in the previous years, in the fourth quarter, it had declined only by about 2.3, 2.4%, which tells you again that the fear of the pandemic is what is really critical for these sectors, the demand in these sectors to come back, which again, highlights the importance of the vaccine program. As I'm sure you've been reading about in the media, the is emphasizing on increasing supply significantly, and there's also from what I've read, the plan to try and increase the daily count to about 1 crore doses a day, all of which will help in really pushing the vaccination and thereby reduce the fear of the pandemic, which is what is really critical for all the sectors, especially the service sectors, also to come back in terms of their recovery.
I'd leave it over there. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, for joining us with your thoughts on the state of the Indian economy and the roadmap from here. Thank you very much. That's the government's chief economic advisor. We've heard from the government. They're clearly banking on pent-up consumption demand to kick in as the second wave of COVID gets over, the economy starts unlocking, and they're hoping that this will create a bounce, which will ensure that the overall growth numbers are not much lesser than what was projected in the budget. For an alternate point of view, I want to go across to one of the most respected voices of the Indian opposition, former Finance and Home Minister in the UPA government, Mr. P. Chidambaram. Mr. Chidambaram, welcome to the Newstrack.
Good evening.
From what we're hearing from the government, there is a high confidence interval that with caseloads coming down as steeply as they are, and as different state governments start unlocking the economy, there will be a sharp bounce in economic activity. Net, the government is hoping that the overall numbers for this financial will not be much lesser than what they projected in the budget. Is that a sense of optimism that you share, or do you have a completely different point of view, Mr. Chidambaram?
It's just bravado at this moment. Anybody who says that the year will show remarkable growth and will bounce back hasn't either done his or her math, or is it whistling in the dark? The point is, we don't know whether there'll be a third wave or a fourth wave. All we can talk about now is only the first quarter. The first quarter this year is practically washed out like the first quarter last year. Last year, please remember that the first quarter ended with minus 24.4.
But not quite like the last year, sir. Many differences. The lockdown not as intense, some economic activity still being allowed. So yes, the economy will certainly take a hit, but it's not quite like the first quarter of last year.
I won't interrupt your question, but you are welcome to interrupt my answer. It is worse than the first quarter of last year. I'll tell you why. Unemployment is now crossed 11%. Number of people pushed below the poverty line is estimated at 23 crore people. Inflation is higher this year than last year at about the same time. You think there is no national lockdown, but add up all the state lockdowns, it practically amounts to a national lockdown. I don't know whether the lockdowns will be extended. I don't know whether the lockdowns will be extended beyond June 30. But surely up to June 30, there is going to be practically no economic activity worth its while. Please remember, automobile companies have closed production for several days a week. I'm not wishing all this happens. I'm only going by the realities around me. The realities around me tell me that the first quarter this year will be just as bad as last year, but since the base is minus 24.4, you will get an illusion of either growth or a small decline. I hope you catch my point. Since the base is minus 24.4, there's an illusory growth. But there's really not going to be any growth in the first quarter.
But the argument that was being made was that A, the decline in cases has been very steep. So while the increase in cases was very, very calamitous, the decline has been steep, much steeper than many would have expected. And secondly, because we learned from the experiences of the first quarter when there were many unknown unknowns at play, this time there are more known unknowns, and therefore we've been able to calibrate the economy in a way that many of the supply chains that have come to a grinding halt in the first quarter of last year are still plying and still functional, and therefore the damage to the economy may not be as severe as last time.
These are assumptions. They are not based on any data. The data is coming in. You don't have data, I don't have data. I'm going by data that is available. I have data on the decline in the labor force participation rate. I have data on unemployment. I have data on the poor sector. I have data on MSMEs. I have data on exports. I have data on imports, and all of them are pointing southward. I'm only talking about the period up to June 30. It's possible that the pandemic wave, which was fast rising, will fast decline also. It's possible that the second wave will end in June 30. I hope it does. But we are only talking about the first quarter. I think the first quarter is practically washed out. But as I said, and ask any statistician, he will tell you, because of the base being minus 24.4, it will give an illusion of a better performance. But that is only illusory.
Given the fact that state governments have now started opening up parts of the economy and that caseload is coming down, as former finance minister, what would be your prescription on the roadmap the government should take in the remaining months of this fiscal to ensure that we're able to get the economy on track as soon as possible, as effectively as possible?
I think they are still sleeping on the job. I don't think they have woken up. If they had woken up, they would listen to Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. They will listen to many other economists and writers. They will listen to the IMF. The point is, when will the government wake up to do more spending, more cash transfers, more distribution of free ration? Unless these three things are done, they were not done last year. They were done in bits and pieces. And then the assessment of the World Bank and others is that although they announced a 20 lakh crore high-sounding Atmanirbhar, the actual stimulus was only about 4 lakh crore. If they wake up now and do all the things that have to be done, which were not done last year, it's still possible to save the remaining 3 quarters, provided there is no third wave or a fourth wave. So we'll assume that there is no third wave or a fourth wave. We'll assume that the second wave will end on June 30 or shortly thereafter, and we'll have a full 8 to 9 months to revive. If they do all these things, the economy will revive. Otherwise, it will return pretty mediocre growth.
No, so you're pushing for printing money. It seems to be down.
I'm pushing for borrowing. There is huge space for borrowing. If at one point of time they think that the borrowing is going beyond the limit, monetize that part of the fiscal deficit, which is print money. I'm not saying print money straight away. I'm saying borrow money first. You've got about 4 lakh crore, I'm told, in the RBI as cash reserves. Spend that first and then borrow. And then if after that you still need money, print money. But that will be a very small number. And when you feel that you've printed maybe a little too much, stop printing. What is this sovereign power to print currency for if you don't use it now?
Let me quote to
Why
you
have
what
that sovereign power?
Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said in a recent interview, responding to questions about not announcing a new stimulus. She says, and I quote, "We're just in May, even the first quarter is not over. The budget, which is designed for a COVID-affected economy, will have to go down to people. We're not even taking that on board, and we've started talking about the need for another big deal stimulus."
That's the confession of failure. The budget was presented on February 1. The year started on April 1. So they had February and March to prepare the departments to spend. And they had April and May to start spending. If after 4 months of the budget, the finance minister would say the budget is not kicked in, I think they are sleeping on the job.
What are you making of the fact that the vaccination numbers are likely to go up, especially from July? We've already been told that this month, 12 crore vaccines will be available. From next month onwards, the government hopes that 1 crore vaccines could be available a day. And if that is the case, then the speed at which we'll be able to inoculate the population, which will have an impact on how soon life can start getting back to normal, will also be faster. So does that give some sense of confidence?
You see, they goofed up on the vaccines. You know why? They placed an order only in January this year, whereas Europe and America, Japan placed orders last May and June. They gave an advance supply order only on end of April, and they had the gall to say on 3rd of May, we gave money last month. They gave it 1 week earlier, the last week of April, but they just without blinking an eye, they said we gave it last month. All right, forget those foibles. So they are late, as a result of which the vaccine program has been seriously interrupted. For example, in Tamil Nadu, there will be no vaccination beginning tomorrow for 4 days because the next lot of vaccines will arrive only on the 6th of June morning. So they'll resume vaccination on the 6th. They don't have vaccines for 4 days. Jharkhand says, Goa says, I have no money to carry out vaccinations. All right, let me assume that they have somehow augmented the supply of vaccines. Now, the best I could gather from news reports is that the total supply of vaccines from the 2 domestic manufacturers will be about 12 and 5, maybe 17 crores a month. I don't know where you get 1 crore a day.
No, because there's also Sputnik. So there's not just Bharat Biotech and SII, there's also Sputnik.
Sputnik has started arriving. The total arrival of Sputnik does not add up to 1 crore doses even now. It may arrive. The point is 30 crore is an ambitious number. I've been asking for the 2 domestic manufacturers to disclose what was your production every month since they started production? What is the dispatch every month? And who did they dispatch to? Why is the government not asking them for these data which is available on the records of the 2 companies? You don't have to invent, you don't have to create anything. It's available every day. What did you produce and pack every day? What did you dispatch every day? And whom did you dispatch? Anyway, the Supreme Court has asked them for numbers. Supreme Court has expressed skepticism over their claim that they'll have 216 crore doses by the end of December. I wish them well, but let them give us an account of how many doses will be available every month in the remaining 7 months beginning today. Let them give that number. We're not going to question the truthfulness of the number. We just want the number on the record.
But Mr. Chidambaram, is there not an element of hypocrisy on the part of the opposition when the government had a centralized vaccine purchase program? Leading lights of the Indian opposition were saying that this government is dictatorial, it's authoritarian, it's control freak, it's not allowing states to go out and purchase vaccines. States should have the freedom, this should be done more democratically. Why can't states go out and buy themselves? And the moment the government tweaked its policy, you and several others like you jumped at the government's new policy and said this is wrong, suggesting that they pivot back to where they started out from.
I strongly object to your insinuation. You are welcome to swallow the government's false narrative, hook, line and sinker. Show me one word I've written.
Not you,
Show
sir.
me one
Not you.
line of story.
Not you,
You
sir.
said you.
I'm saying
You said
Congress
you now.
leaders. Not you, sir. Not
said
you.
you.
Not you. No, not you.
You
I'm
said
talking
you,
about
you
Congress
underlined
leaders.
You
No, sir.
emphasized you raised your voice when you said you.
No, sir. No, no, no. I want to clarify this.
Take back.
I'm not saying you individually, but the Congress party and leading lights
All
of
right,
the
we'll come to
Congress.
that. I've understood your question.
Okay.
I've understood that. Now show me which Congress leader, speaking for the Congress party, said that states must buy the vaccine. From day one, I've been saying states cannot float a tender. In fact, day one, I say 30 states float a tender, and there's only a oligopoly of supply of vaccines to manufacturers. It will only push up prices. States cannot float a tender. States cannot buy the vaccine. What the states asked for, and some states, not all state health ministers, some states said, allow us to distribute the vaccine in the manner we like. Don't tell us 50% for center, 25% for state government hospitals, 25% for private hospitals. Leave that to us. You procure the vaccines, supply it to us, and we will distribute. That was a stand taken by the AIADMK health minister before the DMK took over, and the DMK has not changed its tune. Show me which health minister, and we are only in power in 3 states, Punjab, Chhattisgarh, and Rajasthan. Show me which of the 3 health ministers of Punjab, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh wanted state
No, we saw from the government in Jharkhand, of which you're a part. We saw also from the government in Delhi, which you can say you have nothing to do with. The question was asked
Jharkhand, we are not the government, we are a coalition partner. If you show me the statement of the Jharkhand minister, if the Jharkhand minister said Jharkhand must procure, I think he was wrong.
No.
And I have no hesitation in saying he's wrong.
Sure, I'm glad that you said.
No Congress minister said Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh and Punjab said we must be allowed to procure the vaccines.
But how do you respond to the charge that the government actually had a sensible policy? Now, you can say correctly that it's not Congress health ministers who said this, but leaders of the opposition did.
You withdraw.
No, I never said you. When I said you, I always meant the Congress, because from Rahul Gandhi onwards, they were attacking the government's policy on vaccination. What now you're suggesting, even Mr. Gandhi attacked the government's vaccination policy, said that the government was taking decisions in an authoritarian fashion, that they should be democratized and opened up more. And now you're essentially saying that, and which is perfectly logical, that having one buyer using his buyer's monopoly to try and hammer prices down is the right way to go, which is the right economic principle.
You have cleverly modified your statement. I still maintain the government should have framed the policy in consultation with the states. There should have been a meeting of the state chief ministers or state health ministers before you announce the policy. But I've never said, and we have never said, and show me Mr. Rahul Gandhi's statement. Show me Mr. Rahul Gandhi's statement, date, mode, media, and where it was published, that he said that the states should directly procure vaccines. Show me the statement.
No, the fact that they, no, you're setting the benchmark at a different level.
Right,
I'm making a different point.
The
fact that they criticize the government's policy, criticize that all decisions were being taken by the central government and that this should be left to state governments. This was said by Mr. Gandhi himself.
You're modifying your statement. I still maintain, Rahul, all policy decisions on vaccine procurement, distribution should have been taken in consultation with the states. I still maintain that. In consultation with the states, the center should have said, we'll procure the vaccines and we want to distribute it this way. What do you have to say? The states would have said, give us this much of liberty to distribute it. They could have come to some arrangement. But the center should have consulted the states. But we never questioned the right and the prerogative and duty of the center to procure the vaccines. I mean, elementary economics, if there are two manufacturers,
Sure.
both have received advance supply orders from the central government, how will they sell to the state governments? And if 30 people are bidding between Maharashtra, which is a rich state, and Mizoram, which is a poor state, what chance is Mizoram and Tamil Nadu floated a tender? There are no bidders. I warned about it. I said there will be no bidders. There will be no bidders because why should they supply to you at a price that you quote, whereas the central government is fixed 300, 600 and 1,300? Don't mix up two things. Autocratic, centralized decision making is bad, period. But centralized procurement of vaccine was the only way out to procure the vaccines.
No, because you asked me to quote from Rahul Gandhi.
Tell me, where did he say procurement must be by the states?
नो केंद्र सरकार की वैक्सीन रणनीति नोटबंदी से कम नहीं, आम जन लाइनों में लगेंगे, धन स्वास्थ्य व जान का नुकसान झेलेंगे और अंत में कुछ उद्योगपतियों का फायदा होगा. द चार्ज सर वाज वेरी क्लियर. नाउ you can say he didn't say procurement, but he in all the tweets that he put out is alleging that the government is enriching the industrialists by buying it themselves, that the process should be opened up. This was said again and again, sir.
Sorry, the little Hindi I know, there is no word or words in that quotation of yours which says states must have the freedom to directly procure from the two manufacturers. There's no word. In fact, I'm asking a different question. And I've asked this question in the public media. I said, if states' bids are not getting any response, how are private corporates confidently announcing, we are going to vaccinate all our 100,000 employees, their families, our customers, our business associates? How does a company set apart 100 crore to vaccinate everybody? Where are they getting the vaccines? I want to know that. Are they importing? I have looked at the import data. Except Sputnik, no other vaccine has come to India. It requires an import license. Has anybody given them an import license? Are they getting it from Serum? Are they getting it from Bharat Biotech? Please answer that question. Why are you not investigating that? I'm not saying they should not buy. I'm not saying they should not vaccinate their employees. I congratulate them on that. But please tell us, where are you getting your vaccines when state governments tenders are eliciting no response at all?
Sure. As we conclude the interview, I want to talk a bit about pent-up demand. Now, there are two theories. The government's banking on pent-up demand because everybody's been locked up. As the economy opens up, they'll want to go out, spend, consume. The other side is that there's been so much financial distress, there's been so much death, devastation, and people are still dealing with the consequences of this wave, and therefore there will be no immediate release of this pent-up demand. Which of the two do you believe, sir, is more likely?
There's part truth in both views. The pent-up demand among the rich and the upper middle class will indeed be released, and they will be buying. But that's a very small number. The so-called pent-up demand of the lower middle class and the poor, they are in debt. 23 crore people, according to Azim Premji University, have been pushed below the poverty line. Per capita income has fallen below 1 lakh of rupees for the first time, according to NSO data released yesterday. Another research says that the average borrowing of a family in the lower and poorer sections is 6,000 rupees. They are greater indebtedness. Jan-Dhan accounts have been drawn. They have drawn from Jan-Dhan accounts. Therefore, the pent-up demand will be satisfied by the lower middle class and the poor only after they are able to bring their head above the water. The head is now below the water. The head has to come above the water. They have to pay off their debts. Everybody has incurred debt. Ill or dead, they have incurred debt. So they'll have to pay off their debts, and then some of the pent-up demand will be released, and that may take a few months. Therefore, on balance, both views are correct. The immediate pent-up demand will be a very small section. The larger pent-up demand will be released only later this year, maybe after October or November.
Well, it's always
There is no second wave.
It's always good fun. Lots of insights to have you with us on the Newstrack. You've provided a compelling alternate point of view. We've heard from the government. We've heard from the former finance minister. We leave it to our viewers to decide whose argument seems more persuasive at this moment. Mr. Chidambaram, for joining us on the Newstrack.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.